Welcome to the Courtroom Club. Today we're putting on our Jonker Vorster Attorneys hats. We're diving into something really important if you're thinking about buying property here in South Africa, specifically in 2025. We're talking about purchasing a house that already has tenants living there.
Yeah, it's a common scenario, but it adds definite layers of complexity.
Absolutely. Buying any property is a huge step. We all know that. But when you inherit existing tenants, well, that brings in some very specific legal and financial things you really need to get your head around.
You really do. It's not just about the bricks and mortar then.
Exactly. So our goal today in this deep dive is to give you clarity. Clarity on the rights, the obligations, and crucially, the legal points you need to know for these kinds of deals.
And we're basing this on, the core legal principles and the practical stuff we actually see happening right now in 2025 here at the firm.
Okay, let's kick things off. There's a foundational principle in South African property law, especially for tenanted properties, Horgat Voorkoop.
Hoergat voor koop.
Yeah.
Yes. It's Afrikaans, and it's absolutely central to this whole discussion.
What does it mean exactly?
Literally. Lease prevails over sale. Simple words, but legally powerful.
Powerful how?
Well, it means that when a property is sold and there's a valid existing lease agreement in place, that lease doesn't just disappear.
Ah, okay, so the sale doesn't cancel the lease.
Not at all. It stays completely valid, completely in effect. What happens is you, the new owner, you effectively step into the shoes of the person who sold you the property. You become the new landlord under that existing lease.
Right, inheriting their position, basically.
Precisely. You inherit their rights, but also their responsibilities as laid out on that lease agreement.
Okay, so let's unpack that inheritance. If you're looking at buying a place like this, what's the absolute first thing you need to focus on? From our legal perspective here at Jonker Vorster.
The lease agreement itself, without a doubt.
Can't stress that enough, I imagine.
Absolutely not. That document is the foundation of everything. You need to scrutinize it, really read carefully before you even think about signing that offer to purchase.
Okay, scrutinize what exactly? What are the key things to look for in that lease?
Well, several things jump out. First, the lease duration. Is it a fixed-term lease? Does it have a specific end date? Or is it maybe just running month to month?
Then why does that matter so much?
Because it massively impacts your plans. If you want to move in or renovate or even just change the terms later, knowing the lease duration is step one. A month-to-month gives more flexibility, obviously, than a fixed term with, say, another year left to run.
Okay, duration. What else?
The rental amount. Check it carefully. Is the tenant paying our $5,000 a month, our $15,000? And importantly, how does that compare to similar properties in that specific area right now?
Right, is it market related or way below? That affects the investment side immediately.
Exactly. You need to know if you're buying something that's immediately profitable at that rate or if it's perhaps under rented. Also, critically, who's responsible for what? Maintenance, repairs. Does the lease clearly say what the tenant fixes and what the landlord, which will be you, has to fix?
That can be a big source of conflict if it's vague, I bet.
Oh, absolutely. Clarity there is vital. And finally, look for any early termination clauses. Does the lease say anything about ending it early? Under what conditions? Can the tenant give notice early? Can the landlord? Knowing that is crucial for your own planning.
So the lease sets the specific rules between this landlord and this tenant. But what about the general laws, tenant rights overall?
Great point. Beyond the lease specifics, you've got the Rental Housing Act. That's the big piece of legislation governing rentals in South Africa. And it gives tenants significant legal protections.
Like what, for example?
Well, the main one flowing from Hoergat Voorkoop is they have the right to stay there until the lease legally ends. You, as the new owner, can't just show up on day one and say, okay, time to leave, just because you bought the place.
Unless they've breached the lease, presumably.
Unless they've materially breached the lease, yes, like not paying rent or causing serious damage. But just because ownership changed, no. They also have a right to proper legal notice if you do have grounds to terminate or when the lease is naturally ending.
And you can't just, what, change the locks?
Definitely not. That's an unlawful eviction. Cutting off water or electricity to force them out, also unlawful. Big trouble for the landlord if you try that. The Act protects tenants from that kind of action.
Okay, crystal clear on the tenant side. Let's flip it. What rights do you get as the new owner stepping into that landlord role?
You definitely acquire rights too. Most obvious one is the right to collect the rent, as per the lease agreement.
Makes sense.
You also gain the right to enforce the tenant's obligations under that same lease. If the lease says they must maintain the garden, you can enforce that. If it outlines rules about noise, you can enforce those.
What about rent increases? Can you just raise the rent once you take over?
Ah, good question. You inherit the right to potentially increase the rent, yes, but, and this is a big but, only according to the law, and often, what's stipulated in the lease itself. There might be clauses about annual increases, or it might be governed by general legal principles about reasonable increases.
Yeah.
You can't just decide on an arbitrary new figure overnight.
So follow the rules, essentially.
Always follow the rules. And another key right, which is also an obligation really, is to formally let the tenants know that you are the new owner. Provide your contact details, explain where rent should be paid now. Communication is key.
Okay. Now, for the scenario that worries many buyers, what if you buy this place specifically because you want to live there?
Yeah, that's a common goal. And this is where Hurriyet Vorkoop really bites, potentially. Because as we've said, the lease prevails. You can't automatically kick the tenant out just because you want the house for yourself.
So what are your options then?
Well, the very first step, and often the best one, is negotiation. Talk to the tenant. Explain the situation. See if you can reach a mutual agreement for them to vacate early.
Like offering some kind of incentive.
Exactly. Sometimes offering to cover their moving costs or maybe paying them a month or two's rent as compensation can actually be quicker and cheaper than going through a formal legal process, especially if they're good tenants otherwise.
Makes sense. What if negotiation fails or isn't an option?
Then you need to look closely at that lease again. Is there an early termination clause that applies? Maybe a sale clause? Though those need careful reading. If there's nothing like that, and the lease is fixed term, you generally have to wait until the lease term expires naturally.
And then you just give them notice.
Then you give them the legally required notice to vacate at the end of the lease term. The notice period depends on the lease type and the law. But even then, if the tenant refuses to leave after the notice expires,
Then it gets complicated.
then you have to start a formal eviction process through the courts or the rental housing tribunal. And realistically, that process can take time, weeks, sometimes months, and it involves legal costs. You need to factor that potential delay and expense into your decision if personal occupation is your main goal.
Okay, so weighing it all up, buying a tenanted property, it sounds like there are definite pros and cons.
Absolutely. Let's look at the benefits first, the big one. Immediate rental income.
Cash flow from day one.
Pretty much. The moment transfer happens, you've got rent coming in. That reduces your vacancy risk straight away, makes for a more stable cash flow compared to buying an empty place you then need to find a tenant for.
Any other upsides?
Sometimes, yes. A property with a proven reliable tenant and a solid rental history might actually make it a bit easier to get financing. Lenders like seeing that income stream already in place.
Okay, sounds good. Now the challenges.
The main one we've discussed is flexibility, or lack thereof.
Yeah.
If you want to move in quickly or do major renovations immediately, a sitting tenant bound by a lease can hinder that. You could inherit problems. Maybe there are ongoing disputes between the tenant and the previous landlord that now become your problem. Or maybe the lease itself have clauses that aren't ideal for you, but you're stuck with them.
And pre-existing issues with the property itself.
Yes, especially regarding maintenance. If the previous landlord neglected certain repairs that were their responsibility under the lease, guess whose job it is now?
Yours.
Yours. So you take on responsibility for any existing tenant-related issues or landlord failings.
Right. Given all these potential pitfalls and benefits, what are the absolute must-do steps before someone actually commits, before they sign that final purchase agreement?
Due diligence. Thorough due diligence is non-negotiable. First, as we've hammered home, get copies of all the lease documents, read every single word, understand it fully, don't skim.
Step 1, read the lease properly.
Step 2, inspect the property thoroughly.
Yeah.
Look at its condition. Does it match up with what the lease says about its state or about maintenance? Are there obvious repairs needed that might become your headache?
Okay, inspect carefully. What's next?
Try, if possible, to verify the tenant's payment history. Ask the seller for records, maybe bank statements showing rent deposits, or even permission to speak to the previous managing agent if there was one. Are they reliable payers?
Good point. Get a sense of the tenant's track record.
And talk to the seller. Have a detailed conversation about the lease, about the tenant, any known issues, any agreements made outside the written lease, which ideally shouldn't happen but sometimes does. Clarify everything. Ask those awkward questions. What if the geyser bursts next week? Who usually handles that call according to their practice?
Leave no stone unturned in that discussion.
Precisely. And finally, and honestly, this is probably the most crucial step we advise here at Jonker Vorster Attorneys, Talk to a property law specialist before you sign.
Get legal advice early.
Yes. Investing a small amount in legal advice upfront can save you enormous amounts of time, stress, money down the line. We can review the lease, highlight potential risks you might not have spotted, explain the full legal implications, and help make sure the purchase agreement protects your interests regarding the tenancy. It's what we do every day.
That makes complete sense. Okay, we've covered a lot. Maybe let's quickly touch on some common questions we often hear at the firm about this. People ask, can I just terminate the lease right after I buy?
Usually no, because of your God vor coup.
Can I increase the rent immediately?
Again, usually no, unless the lease specifically allows it or it's done according to legal process.
What if the tenant just won't leave when the lease ends?
That means initiating the formal eviction process, unfortunately.
Is buying tenanted property smart if I want to live there myself?
It can be, but you need to be realistic about timelines and potential legal hurdles, as we discussed.
Can I negotiate with the tenant to leave early?
Yes, definitely worth trying.
Do I have to tell the tenants I'm the new owner?
Yes, absolutely. It's a legal requirement and just good practice.
And what are my responsibilities as the new landlord?
Basically, everything the previous landlord was responsible for under the Lease and the Rental Housing Act. Maintenance, deposit handling, respecting tenant rights.
Right, so these are all complex questions, and the exact answers depend on the specific lease and situation, which is why getting tailored advice is so important.
Exactly. So, to wrap up, buying a property with tenants in South Africa in 2025, it definitely offers opportunities that immediate income is appealing, but it comes with real complexities.
Understanding that Hergat vor Koop principle is just the starting point.
It is. You need to really grasp the lease details, know the tenant's rights, understand your own rights, and importantly, your obligations as the new landlord. And the eviction process, if it comes to that, needs careful handling.
So the recommendation is clear.
Absolutely. If you're seriously considering buying a property with tenants, we strongly recommend you contact us here at Jonker Vorster Attorneys. Get expert legal guidance tailored specifically to your situation. It really can make the whole process smoother and ensure you're legally protected.
Sound advice. And perhaps a final thought for our listeners. As you look at properties, always keep that phrase, Hergat vor Koop, in the back of your mind. Think about its long-term impact on how you can use and manage that property. It's more than just a legal term. It fundamentally shapes your rights as an owner from day one.